I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Wiradjuri land, the land of the three rivers that I live and work on. The title of my presentation today is Clinical Treatment of Functional Seizures, and I'm going to be looking at a woman who has experienced torture and refugee trauma. This presentation is of a woman from a community where there's a high incidence of functional seizures that have been recorded in a study of women in a refugee camp. START's clinicians have also noted significant occurrence of functional seizures amongst women from this community background who are settling in regional New South Wales. For confidentiality, the name and personal details of the client have been changed. So my presentation today will cover the prevalence of functional seizures in refugee populations, socio-political, historical, geographical context of the client's experience, presenting problems, and then I'll go through assessment, formulation, therapeutic goals, intervention outcomes, and future treatment plan. Across the general population, the prevalence of functional seizures is reported to be 0.033%. In a study of forcibly displaced people living in Germany, the prevalence was recorded at 9.8%. For forcibly displaced Yazidi women living in a refugee camp with no history of sexual violence, prevalence of 16.7%. And with those women with a history of sexual violence as captives of ISIS, the prevalence is 43.7%. Those women also have a high prevalence of other mental health problems. The community that I'm talking about today, the Yazidi, come from northern Iraq. The Yazidi or Azidi, a minority living in northern Iraq, northern Syria, western Iran and eastern Turkey. Yazidism is a non-Abrahamic, orally transmitted monotheistic religion. It's a closed ethno-religious group, which means that you can't join or leave, and there are consequences for not complying, including losing identity and community relations. The structure incorporates hereditary castes that have defined relationships with sacred customs and status. The Yazidi have experienced a long history of episodes of persecution and massacres over the last 1,000 years. Some of this is due to misunderstanding within cultural religious narratives of some other regional groups that Yazidi name, sacred symbols and beliefs are heretical. And the Yazidi have a common cultural collective identity of being very sacred people and the most persecuted people. On the 3rd of August 2014, the ancestral home of the Yazidis in Shingal was attacked by ISIS, who killed, kidnapped, enslaved thousands of men, women and children, displacing the community to refugee camps in Turkey and internally displaced person camps in Iraq. Many people fled up the mountain and endured deprivation of food, water and shelter during their refugee flight. I'm calling my client Lenny for the purposes of this presentation. Lenny is a 50-year-old woman married with 2 girls aged 12 and 8. She arrived on a humanitarian visa with her husband and lives in regional New South Wales. She is Yazidi, speaks Kurmanji and has some Arabic. She's attended counselling regularly at STARTS for 2 years, mostly face-to-face, with telephone counselling during COVID pandemic restrictions. Her husband is her carer, and this prevents his participation in TAFE English classes. Presenting problems. Lenny feels fear all the time. She reports nightmares every night, typically of attack by ISIS. She has intrusive memories of witnessing killings and herself and her baby being threatened with death. She experiences poor sleep and she has a fear of going to sleep because of nightmares. She has traumatic history of grief and loss. She experiences frequent dissociative attacks leading to collapse. And psychosocial functioning is affected by these dissociative attacks. So that it limits her cooking, housework, bathing, participating in family activities and in socialising. She feels embarrassment, shame and a stigma of having dissociative attacks in public, and she feels the judgment of her community. On assessment, Lenny typically presents as neatly groomed, dressed for the weather in tops and pants. Her head is down, her brow is furrowed. She looks fearful and sad. Sometimes her eyes are darting. She describes her mood variously as sad or angry, and usually emphasises the entrenched nature of these feelings of just like before or nothing has changed. She is frequently distressed from extreme tiredness. Her speech has a rate and tone congruent to her mood, and her explanations are logical. Lenny tries to engage in counselling. However, frequent periods of dissociation are evident where she's observed to be staring into space and looking fearful. Many sessions, particularly early sessions, and this hasn't stopped, Lenny will collapse. And she's very apologetic after these collapses. PTSD, anxiety and depression assessments were conducted with Lenny, and she has a very high scale for PTSD. Now, I've presented this genogram here. Lenny's the middle child of a large family. She was raised in a large extended family with close bonds, particularly to her mother and sisters. The extended family lived in the same street in the village with aunties and their families. Family life was in and out of each other's houses with intimate bonding between multiple family members. Lenny's husband's family also lived on the same street. As a married woman, she lived together with her husband, his parents and siblings, spouses and children, and continued to maintain intimate relationships with her own family. Prior to the war, Lenny's husband described her as fun-loving, interested in her appearance and fashion, and she loved parties. Lenny described herself, "There was no one happier than me when my children were born." Lenny had never lived apart from her family until the Yazidi genocide. Her siblings and their families are now living in insecure and impoverished conditions in internally displaced persons camps in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. Her mother died in Shingal because of ISIS, along with other family and neighbours. Other siblings are now in Germany. In Australia, Lenny has a small nuclear family of just herself, her husband and 2 children with no other relatives. In terms of her trauma history, this is a summary. She witnessed atrocities and killings when the village was invaded by ISIS. She was personally attacked by ISIS militants who threatened to kill her and take her baby from her. She fled with her children up the mountain, experienced deprivation, witnessed death of neighbours and their children. She walked for many days carrying her baby, a dangerous flight with episodes of terror, and she lived in a refugee camp for 4 years. The complex interaction of challenges is represented by this graphic, which was developed by Orochi and Shallow, called Towards a Systematic Approach in 1994. And this is a key formulation utilised at STARTS. In addition to the trauma reactions that I will talk about, Lenny experienced extremely protective and anxious about her youngest child due to the life experience. And in terms of normal life challenges, she's also going through menopause. Resettlement and cultural transition includes not being able to participate in English language classes due to the trauma acuity, and this hampers her settlement. In the recovery environment, the determination of the diagnosis of functional seizures took time. Lenny had frequent ED assessments after collapses frequent self-preservation, and being taken by services providing a duty of care to the emergency department. Assessment and elimination of physical causes of collapse and ruling out epilepsy meant multiple medical interventions. These were hampered by being in a rural location and through the time of the COVID pandemic. Her community mental health psychiatrist initially diagnosed PTSD, generalised anxiety disorder, and had functional seizures as a differential diagnosis. And from this point, other investigations ensued. Lenny and her husband had difficulty understanding and communicating about the collapses, partly due to translation difficulties for terms, fainting, collapse, seizure, and similar terms into Comanche and Arabic. An interpreter informed me that the terms are not differentiated at all in Comanche, there's just one term. Multiple other significant health issues are present for Lenny, her husband, and children. And because of limited access to services, this has required a lot of travel to Sydney with long stays and additional stress. I've mentioned the COVID restrictions, and in addition, the family had to move accommodation. So very complex. Also, rejection of application for family members to come to Australia, and recently concern about ISIS families and former militants returning to Australia, and the potential that that might cause a threat. In terms of international events, there's ongoing insecurity in Shingal and the internally displaced person camps, including things like fires and people losing everything and dying in those fires. Opening of mass graves, return of kidnapped girls and women used as sex slaves by ISIS, and family and neighbours still missing, and of course the anniversary of the Yazidi genocide. But in the mix of all this are also protective factors: the support of her husband, commitment to her children, her Yazidi identity, and the committed support by settlement support services, which I really want to emphasise their role in assisting Lenny. So I'm going to talk about functional seizures that Lenny experiences. She typically has 3 to 5 seizures a day. And the expression of the seizures has a cultural dimension, which is called the seizure scaffold by Rockcliffe, Feidler and Willis. She clutches her throat with both hands, with her neck extended. Her husband manages this by pulling and holding her hands away from her throat. Her muscles are very stiff and tense, and it requires a great deal of effort to pull the hands down. She loses consciousness. She may be shaking and then goes limp. She becomes conscious and recovers. During the initial process, she may call out, "Don't take my baby," or "Don't kill me." And she frequently has these functional seizures in the counselling session. In addition, she may collapse prior to the session, in the waiting room, in the car on the way to the session, in the house prior to the appointment, as well as at other times of the day. From my experience and reports from other STARTS clinicians, many Yazidi women express dissociative attacks in demonstrative ways. This may include wailing or thrashing about prior to collapse. The formulation of these functional seizures, in addition to all of the stresses that I've mentioned so far, the onset of the functional seizures was very specifically at the time of the Yazidi genocide. Prior to collapse, Lenny has some body sensations that indicate different levels of physiological and psychological activation. Sometimes she feels cold right through her body, but particularly in her hands, and she feels sluggish. Sometimes she feels hot and breathless. They may happen when she is angry. This is more often a report that's given by others that just prior to the collapse, she was very angry. She also reports an intrusive flashback memory of the face of the ISIS militant who threatened her. The onset after Lenny notices the body sensations happens very quickly, and the functional seizures themselves may last for 20 minutes. Of course, they take place in the context of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and the frequency of the seizures are associated with triggers and stress events. Lenny describes that she cannot tolerate the level of pain that she feels, and also as, look what ISIS has done to me. We had different therapeutic goals for the treatment. Lenny's goals are to stop the collapses and to gain assistance to sponsor her sister to come to Australia to assist her, and to get another carer if this was not possible, so her husband could go to TAFE and improve the family's settlement, and support for an NDIS application. My goals were to develop the therapeutic relationship, create safety, reduce the PTSD symptoms, reduce the frequency and intensity of the functional seizures, improve Lenny's sense of control over her life, and support her settlement. So the intervention framework was holistic. It's to develop an understanding of counselling, because counselling was a new concept. So building the therapeutic relationship was crucial. That involved, of course, establishing safety and trust, taking a non-judgmental stance, having an empathic attitude, emphasising confidentiality, and acknowledging and validating her experiences. Engaging with the strengths and values, exploring the importance of family, community, and religion. Utilising the strengths of the religion was challenging due to the sacred aspects of the religion not being disclosed to outsiders, related to cultural and historical history of persecution. Understanding and developing how the family and husband manage functional seizures, and understanding and developing how Lenny manages the functional seizures, and building on these things. So intervention included psychoeducation, and the model that I used with Lenny was an overactive danger detection system in her brain causing trauma, which led to her seizures, her functional seizures. I also did psychoeducation with her husband, and we utilised the model of the brain and tried to emphasise what might be happening from a Western medical point of view. Gentle exploration of life experiences and exploring strategies to address prolonged grief. Exploration of the meaning of the seizures for Lenny. Narrative development of the trauma story, incorporating elements of strength, resilience, and resistance into her own story to emphasise the things that she had done to survive the events that she'd experienced, and things that she continued to have access to that couldn't be taken away from her. An example of utilising strengths and values focus is to identify the value of caring as a mother and wanting the best for her children. Exploration with Lenny of where this value came from her own mother, and that despite the terror that was inflicted on her, this value remains. It cannot be taken away from her, and utilising this to inform some strategies to reduce stress system activation. And an exploration of what the functional seizures meant to Lenny is that she needs looking after by her sister. They are always linked to the Yazidi genocide. She never forgot what ISIS did to family, friends, community, and herself. They're the embodiment of the terror of her experience, symbolically dying in front of people. And Lenny's husband, being the carer, crosses gendered norms of caring and contributes to shame that Lenny feels about her psychosocial functioning impact. Also developed self-compassion, managing black and white thinking. No one helps me was a common thing Lenny said. and the mind and body strategies for reducing the stress system activation. So managing the stress system to manage trauma symptoms and functional seizures. Explored the potential of warning signs for functional seizures using breathing regulation exercises. This was not always successful because Lenny found it quite difficult to focus on her breathing, but it's developed. Mindfulness exercises using the 5 senses to develop the capacity to switch between attention modes and come back to the present, switching from looking to hearing to feeling. Progressive muscle relaxation for awareness of body sensations and develop capacity to change muscle tension. Body scan of body sensations and imagining breathing in calm energy to reduce tension in parts of the body. We explored body mapping, but this wasn't very successful with Lenny. She just scribbled black all over the entire page to indicate how distressed she was. And in self-compassion, putting a smile on the face, using the butterfly hug, spreading feelings of care and love through the body. And I also used imaginal relaxation. Ideas that worked for Lenny were imagining walking in the garden and examining a flower with the 5 senses, or imagining looking at her children playing, noticing their happy faces, the sound of their voices, and seeing their smiles. Outcomes. The process is ongoing. The process wavers, but continues. For Lenny, her physical appearance and body language changes over time. She has developed more capacity to maintain good eye contact and smile in sessions. Black and white thinking and catastrophic thinking has changed. She's able to notice and challenge these patterns when they happen. She's developed a more coherent story of her trauma experiences that includes some of the nuance about her capacity despite all of the terror that she still experiences. And she has an increased capacity to examine implications of these life experiences in terms of her own life values and future goals. She has a greatly reduced frequencies of seizures in counselling sessions, although there is no reduced number of seizures that Lenny reports in her daily life. She's able to engage with body and mind stress management strategies when she's distressed, and she self-reports that these are sometimes helpful. She self-reports that she can sometimes stop intrusive image of an ISIS attacker moving from her peripheral vision to her central vision, so she can maintain it in her central vision. She has increased confidence. She's joined a trauma-informed yoga group run by STARTS. And she now has assistance for her psychosocial functioning, supported by carers from NDIS. This has assisted her confidence as well. In terms of assessment measures, Lenny's answers to these really convey how serious the experience is for her, and it doesn't reproduce in terms of numerical or Likert scale reduction. Some of this is to do with her own insistence and wanting me to know that it's still terrible and how terrible it is. And some of it is to do with the challenges of working with telephone interpreters across the medium when across that complexity. Okay, so in terms of future treatment, I want to emphasise additional psychoeducation with a husband and Lenny to manage the functional seizures. And I see the importance of involving her husband, recognises and utilises his influential position within the family and culture related to patriarchal norms. And it assists him to improve his understanding and be able to offer constructive support to Lenny. Knowledge and engagement assists to reduce stress for Lenny and for her husband and family. Also, further work focused on shame. Culturally influenced somatic manifestation of emotional distress combines with the perception of deep shame and the fear of being excluded from the community as part of the seizure scaffold of functional seizures is a hypothesis proposed by Kieselhan that I think is worth exploring further. And explore cultural ways of healing, rituals and practices that may add to mind-body stress system reduction and experience of understanding, and work on balancing hope and acceptance. Lenny has a sense that this is an ongoing condition related to NDIS disability, and that is impacting her hope, but maintaining that hope and the potential for change, but the acceptance of the process and the acceptance of some of the circumstances of her life in Australia will be an ongoing focus. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today this complex circumstance and the work that I've been able to do so far to assist my client.